Now, from Atlanta News First, the issues that matter to you. This is On the Record.
You know, they say we might be back here in November. So, this might not be goodbye.
Thank you.
But if we come back here and redraw lines in November, it ain't the Democrats who need to be worried.
Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones with a warning for his Republican colleagues who put off any efforts to redraw Georgia's election maps for now. Just one of the topics we're discussing today on our On the Record podcast. We're so glad you're with us. I'm Rick Folbaum, along with my colleague Doug Reardon. Our producer, Tim Darnell, is here as well. And we have a lot to talk about, Doug, as we preview our show for this coming Sunday. And let's dive into this comment, which sort of seemed like an offhanded remark, sort of on his way out the door for Lieutenant Governor Jones. What exactly was he talking about? That Republicans really are the ones who should be worried about this?
Yeah, I don't think anything is offhand at this point, right? And now Lieutenant Governor Jones is officially a lame duck, so he is speaking very freely to these lawmakers. And of course, this may be his last time in the dais before we start a new legislative session next year. If we don't have a special session in between, more to come on that later. But I think what Burt Jones was saying to Republicans was kind of twofold. They put off this redistricting effort, which of course Governor Kemp and we know President Trump really wanted. And so that's, I think, the first part of this. President Trump has been really cracking down on state legislatures to get these maps passed so that in 2028, Republicans will have better standing when it comes to these political maps. And so I think Burt Jones was alluding to the fact that not only his president, but also his close friend, Donald Trump, was warning lawmakers that if you don't do this, there could be political repercussions for you coming down from the White House. The other thing I think he was noting to lawmakers was that we got to get this done at some point. And, there is going to be political backlash the longer that you drag this out. We already saw that they had kind of caved to, I don't care what they say about the reasons for it, caving to a little bit of political backlash when it came to knowing that redrawing these maps could energize Democratic voters really, really heavily in the areas where they stood to be most affected. And so I think Burt Jones is telling lawmakers, we better get this done before, the political implications start to really outweigh our ability to maybe get ourselves some more seats.
You mentioned President Trump and his involvement in all of this. Of course, he wanted Republican governors to redraw states' maps in time for this midterm election. Forget about 2028. He won't be on the ballot. He's trying to help his party in the midterms at a time when the Republican Party is probably going to be losing some seats. If history is any indication, the party that is in power tends to lose seats in midterm elections. And the president was trying to reverse that trend, or at least stave that off as best as he could. And that's not happened here in Georgia, of course. But that was one of the topics that was addressed during this special session that wrapped up on Tuesday. Let's just hit through the other two main subjects. Property taxes. What happened with that?
Not much. And that was kind of the same result as at the end of the regular session. This was going into that regular session. The biggest thing for House Republicans was to get measurable property tax decreases solidified. They actually started wanting to eliminate them altogether at the same time that the Senate was considering eliminating income tax, and those two things just didn't really mesh when it came to revenue. And so actually neither one got done. So Republicans said, hey, we're coming back. We have a chance to maybe pass some more meaningful tax legislation again on property levies. And they didn't. Democrats, they needed just about every single one of them in the House to get this measure passed because it did require 2/3 support for a constitutional amendment. Would have let citizens go to the ballot and vote on this for their own municipalities. But it was just too much for Democrats. They said the same thing that they said during the regular session. How are you going to backfill this hole that is going to come out of municipalities' revenues when you take away property taxes? Of course, we know the option was a sales tax, 1 penny for every dollar spent on retail in that area. And Democrats said, okay, so basically what you're doing is eliminating property taxes. Great for homeowners, but you're imposing this sales tax on people who aren't homeowners or who may not be homeowners. Yeah, and getting zero benefit from this at all, except for an increased sales tax. That didn't sit well with the party, and they absolutely were able to stave this off again the same way that they were during regular session, much to the frustration of Republicans who, again, made this their biggest cornerstone of their policy wish list, if you will, and for a second time could not get it done.
And the other main thing that the lawmakers were supposed to talk about and figure out a solution for was counting our votes in Georgia's voting system, QR codes, which were made illegal by the state legislature in the last session, although they didn't come up with a remedy for it. They just made it illegal, and that deadline coming up July 1st. So they were getting together to try to hammer out some kind of a deal in time for the upcoming midterm elections. They didn't do that either.
Nope. I would say kind of, right? There was a little bit of can kicking that went on. They pushed that deadline that they imposed on themselves, by the way, to 2028. So when the calendar flips to the year 2028, that's when those QR codes will be illegal. But that is plenty of time, you would think, for lawmakers to figure out some sort of replacement for these QR codes. The way they're going to do that is they're going to seat a study committee to look into the best system that Georgia should be using, whether that be hand-marked paper ballots or some other system of tabulation, going into the 2028 presidential election. Of course, we know it probably won't be those Dominion machines. That was what caused a lot of strife among election skeptics back in 2020, and really has driven the narrative on elections here in Georgia ever since then. And so the only issue that Democrats really had with this, besides the fact that they felt a lot of this was built on false claims in the first place, was that they may not get a seat on that study committee. They may have no say at all. There's nothing in that bill saying Democrats have to be seated on this study committee. And that really really upset that party, because they, of course, feel like they should, and many voters also that we've talked to feel like they should have a seat on that study committee and a say in how Georgians are voting in 2028. Many of them are their constituents. And so we'll see how that all works out. But we do have some time now. We have about a year and a half, a little more than that, to figure out how to vote in 2028. And Republicans will pretty much mostly have the say in that.
So I got to talk this week with two of the leaders in the state legislature, the minority leader, Democrat Harold Jones, and the Republican majority leader, Jason Anabatarte. You might not be surprised, spoiler alert, they both gave themselves an A for this special legislative session. How could they both say that things went exactly as they wanted it to go?
Well, we'll take all of it with a grain of salt, I think. Here's the sad thing, I think, from my point of view, just watching this as an observer. You can give yourself an A, and that's all well and good, but you're giving yourself an A because you were able to not do things, right? You were able to stave off Democrats.
Prevent things from happening.
You were able to, if you're a Republican, stave off Democrats from sitting on this committee. If you were a Democrat, you were able to stave off property tax measures. And so, it's all well and good if you think that these are things that are bad for your constituents, which really, is what Democrats and Republicans feel like is the case. But really nothing got done here. We didn't redistrict. We kicked the can down the road on elections, and we didn't get any tax legislation passed at all. There was a lot of bickering, a lot of infighting, and a lot of posturing between the parties. And so I think if you look at maybe their respective goals, sure, you can give them an A. But if you look at how the voters fared on a report card, I would say it is a much lower grade than that.
I want to talk to you real quick about, this is really the first full week after the runoff elections last Tuesday, a week ago Tuesday. So now we know who's going to be on the ticket, who's going to be on the ballot for the November midterms. And it's been very interesting to see sort of these early days of these campaigns now going after one another, trying to obviously set the tone early on, even though I think probably a lot of voters are now going to tune out a little bit until after Labor Day, probably. But still, it's a time for the candidates to really get their messages out there. And we heard from the Bottoms campaign this week with a, kind of a bold challenge right out of the gate with the former Atlanta mayor challenging Rick Jackson, her opponent in the gubernatorial race in November, to 3 televised debates. How did that go over?
Well, we got a response just a couple minutes ago as of us recording this, from Rick Jackson, who was very blunt and said, what did he say? I believe he said, I will debate her. I'll debate her at some point, right?
Let me tell you
what
was
the
said.
Exact quote. I'm
said,
not far off.
No, you're very close. Of course, this is in a radio interview that he granted.
Right.
Of course, I'll debate her. From that standpoint, I look forward to it. I think there's a clear choice and a difference. So very non-specific, which is what his campaign told us earlier in the week when we reached out and said, does he accept the challenge? the campaign said, well, we look forward to contrasting blah, blah,
the
blah,
records
without saying anything about the debate.
It's fairly non-committal, but I will point out that Rick Jackson only committed to one debate during the primary and runoff season. We had actually tried to get a debate going between himself and Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, and we just could not do that. And so, different candidates have their reasons for wanting to debate or not wanting to debate. I think as long as there is some level of a face-off between these two so that voters can, as Rick Jackson said, contrast the resumes of both of them. That is important. As for whether we'll get three, I'm not sure. If Rick Jackson is non-committal at this point, he may not want to agree to 3 different debates over the course of these next few months. But, obviously, Keisha Lance Bottoms feels very confident in making this challenge so early in this cycle and being so specific. You would think that they came into this general election season with a plan, no matter who they were going to be going up against for this debate layout. And she wants one a couple days before the actual in-person general election vote. So we'll just have to wait and see on that. We've had our fair share of frustrations with trying to do our debates here, and so we're gonna kick back and see what's agreed to.
Yeah, we should say Atlanta News First has issued invitations to the 4 main campaigns for the U.S. Senate seat and for the governor's seat, and so we'll keep you posted as we attempt to get a debate here on Atlanta News First and Gray Media. Let's talk about a unity within the Republican and the Democratic parties. It was a bruising primary, especially for the Republicans who had to figure out their nominees while the Democratic nominees had already been set. They didn't go to runoffs. Now it's time for everybody to sort of come together. On the Democratic side, we've already seen a joint appearance by Senator Ossoff and Mayor Bottoms. They have another one planned for tomorrow, Saturday, in Savannah, Georgia. We are not seeing those kinds of events scheduled, at least not yet, for Mike Collins and Rick Jackson.
And I think if you just look at the election results and how things played out on the GOP and the Democratic side, I think certainly voters on the Democratic side would point to the lack of runoffs and even the lack of a challenge to Senator Ossoff and say, look, we are unified. We know who we want, and we all got behind these people, and that is a good sign for Democrats. I think Republicans would argue that they are having some healthy debate among who they think is the best person for these jobs. 2 runoffs in the U.S. Senate and the gubernatorial race, respectively, and by the way, 2 pretty close ones, too. I mean, I know that Senate one was a little more of a blowout than the gubernatorial race, but we were talking 4 or 5 points between the 2 of those candidates, which when you're talking about 500,000 to 1 million voters, that's a slim margin. So,
yeah.
I think that the other issue, of course, that Rick Jackson has is Mike Collins is kind of a firebrand. He is a bit of an unpredictable candidate. We know he had a couple of, big news headlines throughout that primary cycle where he had 2 and still does have 2 open ethics investigations against him in the House for things that members of his staff are alleged to have done. He also had to fire someone from his campaign for making a wildly insensitive tweet about a alleged victim of sexual assault. And so these are the types of things that you really want to be wary of if you're Rick Jackson, hitching your horse, to that wagon. And I think that there's a lot less hesitancy to do that if you're Keisha Lance Bottoms and John Ossoff, who already kind of know each other. They have a working relationship. Keisha Lance Bottoms was in D.C. for a couple of years. And, by and large, I think John Ossoff is the one that has to be more careful there because people will really tie that anvil of 2020 and not running for a second term around Keisha's neck. And, I think at this point it's good until it isn't. That's what we heard from our political expert, Ben Taylor, last week. This could work as a ticket. You just have to make sure that everyone's firing on all levels, so to speak.
Well, I was in touch this morning with someone inside the Jackson campaign who suggested that there will be joint appearances between Rick Jackson and Mike Collins down the line, but that just obviously is not happening just yet. Also wondering about an endorsement from Burt Jones, who the lieutenant governor that we started this podcast with, who we heard from, who is, as you called him, a lame duck, which of course he is, and he was the loser in that runoff election to Rick Jackson. There seems that there are still some hard feelings between those 2 men.
No question about it. All you had to do was watch, 10 minutes of television throughout the last couple months to see that they do not like each other. And I don't think that will change. I think at some point you will see some support from the lieutenant governor going towards Rick Jackson, but I think it's still very raw for the lieutenant governor right now. He beat him in that primary race and then ended up losing in the runoff. There were a lot of reporters kind of crowding around the lieutenant governor after the results were announced. And someone point blank asked him, will you support Rick Jackson? He didn't say anything to that question. And so I don't think that now is the time, if the time ever comes. But those two really have built a bitter rivalry over the last couple of months. And I think with the lieutenant governor being a bit more of the establishment candidate, you'll see a lot of people who endorse Burt Jones endorse Rick Jackson strictly because he is the nominee now. I'm more interested to see as well, too, how this plays out with President Trump. Will he come down here and support Rick Jackson? Will he do some of those telecalls that he did with Burt Jones to really bolster the candidacy of someone who does not have a history of having a political apparatus and a campaign, having run a campaign before. So I'm interested to see what everybody does here in the Republican Party now that this turned out to be maybe a bit of a surprise.
We'll be watching. So on the record this Sunday morning at 11 on Atlanta News First, and then streaming after that on all of our digital platforms, including YouTube and wherever you're watching us right now. We have a state senator, Sonia Halpern, who was, of course, a part of that special session. We'll be able to sort of debrief her and get the lowdown, find out what went on behind the scenes, especially when it comes to the Democrats and the strategy that they played in the special session. And we have Julianne Thompson, who's going to be here as well. She's a longtime Republican consultant and strategist, and she'll be able to give us some good insight into these questions about the Republicans that we've all been asking. Ben Taylor will be here as well, political scientist. And we're going to pay tribute at the end of the show to Martha Zoller, who, of course, is a longtime, well-respected radio show host and one-time political candidate herself, a conservative who really had a lot of friends and admirers on both sides of the political aisle. And so we will remember her on our program as well. So we ask you to tune in again Sunday mornings at 11 or stream us whenever you want. But for now, I'm Rick Folbaum along with Doug Reardon and Tim Darnell. We'll see you soon. Thanks.
Thank you for watching ANF Plus. For more breaking news, live coverage, and your community stories, download the Atlanta News First app. You can also watch us on YouTube, Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV. To join the conversation on YouTube Live, visit our channel and hit subscribe. You can also listen to the Atlanta News First podcast by searching Atlanta News First on your preferred listening platform.